Today, I want to focus on a question that I see floating around a lot on the internet. It is, how the fuck did Oko happen?
Buckle up. 2020 is going to have more powerful magic.
That it just gets too much value when it comes down. And yes, these other cards are really good, but I think it's Oko that's holding them together.
This is like the classic card where you won't try to be an ass by doing it, but you will play it against your opponent, you'll be killing them with it, and you'll be complaining about the card. You'll be like, this card is so stupid. Anyways, here, take this stupid food token. I'll get your creature. Yeah, Oko's just a mistake. I can't believe they printed this. Anyways, land Dork into Oko on 2. What are you going to do?
October 4th, 2019, the newest expansion for Magic the Gathering, Throne of Eldraine, was released with a lot of excitement behind it. The fairy tale setting was goofier than what had come before, but it had a lot of charm. It was the start of a new set rotation, with the previous sets of Ixalan, Rivals of Ixalan, Dominaria, and Core 2019 rotating out of Standard. With the new environment, people were eager to see how the fresh card pool would shake out, myself included. However, one card was tucked into the set that in the coming months would become one of the most infamous cards in the game's 25 years of history: Oko, Thief of Crowns. Oko was the brand new planeswalker added to the expanding cast and was the set's villain, yet he would also go on to be the villain of the set in the real world too. Hello, welcome to the Noctamoon Archives. I'm the Minotaur Reviewer. Normally, on Reddit, I rate how cards in a new MTG set can be used for Minotaur-based decks, but today I want to try something new and talk about a subject I find very interesting. Oko was a beautiful disaster, the likes of which hadn't been seen before. So come with me as we examine the facets of Oko's design, format impacts, and the discourse he created in the Magic community. Before we go into what made this card so divisive, we need to look at the characterization of Oko first. The reason is that Magic planeswalkers have more flavor tied to their card abilities than most other characters. Who the planeswalker is often sets out what they can do and what abilities we can expect them to have. Gideon can make an invincibility shield, so every iteration allows him to become a creature with invulnerability. Tezzeret is an artificer, so he will often have abilities that interact with artifacts or derive value from them. Oko's character was revealed in a Forbes article leading up to the release. In it, it describes that Oko's unnamed home plane is one where a Fae-based government suppresses the abilities of Fae they deem to be a threat to social order. Oko was one of these Fae due to him being a powerful shapeshifter. He was persecuted by his government until he sparked and was able to travel the multiverse. This led Oko to mistrust everyone, and especially any form of governance. In his journeys, Oko would act as a disruptive planeswalker to hold up a mirror to the society and shine light on hypocrisy. The consequences be damned. The article lists examples of what some of these pranks would be: ruining a wedding day, stealing the spotlight at someone's lifetime achievement, fooling a mother into believing her child had returned home from a conflict. He's basically the logical extreme of a YouTube prank channel. In addition to this, Oko is bound to the colors of green and blue, with black being speculated on based on some of the art used for his Planeswalker deck. With these color restrictions and Loki-esque motives, we can assume Oko's abilities are about combat tricks, transformations, and chaos. So, the card itself. Oko, Thief of Crowns, is a 3-mana planeswalker that starts at 4 loyalty points. Plus 2 loyalty to make a food token, which is an artifact that can be sacrificed for 2 mana and gain you 3 life. For plus 1, you can turn any artifact or creature into a 3/3 elk with no other abilities. Finally, for minus 5 loyalty, you can exchange control of an artifact or a creature you control with an opponent's creature if it had 3 or less power. If you started playing Magic after the release of Eldraine, you may ask yourself, how is this the most powerful and most hated card in the game? The answer to that is how efficient Oko is at everything. The average Planeswalker costs about 4.6 mana, and the average Planeswalker has a starting loyalty of about 4.26. So, relative to the cost, Oko is ahead of the curve by being a 3-mana Planeswalker with 4 loyalty. So, based on that, Oko is above average significantly in cost and starting loyalty. It is also important to note that 3-mana Planeswalkers are notorious for their strength in their respective standard environments and beyond. Notable examples being Liliana of the Veil, Liliana Last Hope, Gideon of the Trials, Narset Parter of Veils, Saheeli Rai, and Teferi Time Raveler. This is because they can be played sooner and develop themselves before your opponent has a chance to deal with them. With less answers in Standard, you need to exhaust more resources to remove these planeswalkers and allow for your opponents to run away with the match. However, to understand the power of Oko, you first need to understand how hard he is to remove. Oko could come down as soon as turn 2, thanks to Gilded Goose or any other mana dork, and then could go up to 6 loyalty by opting to make a food token. Now, in Standard by this point in the game, most creatures would be able to attack on turn 2 or 3 with only power of about 2 or 3, meaning at the very worst, Oko will have 3 loyalty on your next turn. From there, you can then turn that food token into a 3/3 elk to defend him while playing out the rest of your deck's creatures, like Questing Beast or Wicked Wolf. This makes attacking into Oko a losing game, as you can build up a board state while your opponent wastes his resources. Then, later in the game, Oko can turn their threat creatures into 3/3 elks without abilities, invalidating any opportunity for the tables to turn. So, Oko shuts down creature-based decks, which are how most games of Magic are won. So what about control? There were a bunch of spells printed that could kill or exile a planeswalker, but in the prior set of Core 2020, Veil of Summer was printed. It was part of a cycle of 5 uncommon instants and sorceries, each of which would punish an opponent for playing their enemy colors. Most of these saw sideboard play, but Veil of Summer was mainboarded. This is because, for 1 green mana, you and your permanents could not be targeted by blue or black spells. Spells can't be countered, and you would draw a card if a blue or black spell had been cast. This meant that the primary colors for dealing with Oko were nullified, so there wasn't any point to play that style of deck.
You serious?
With the other new cards, like Once Upon a Time, you could smooth your deck's consistency, and the new Questing Beast made it easy to attack into your opponent's elks. In addition, Nissa, who shakes the world, would double the mana your forests produced, allowing you to ramp into a large Hydroid Krasis. However, Oko had an interesting interaction with Nissa. She can make a land into a 0/0 with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. So, if Oko then made that land into a 3/3 elk, the +1/+1 counters would remain. So, each turn, you could essentially make a 6/6 creature with haste in addition to your other threats. Simply put, at the time the only way to beat Oko in Standard was to play Oko yourself. And in no time at all, we got a plethora of Oko memes. So many memes. Within a month and a half of Oko being printed, it was banned in Standard, along with Once Upon a Time and Veil of Summer, which was unprecedented at the time with WotC's bannings. So let's dig into what happened in the design and testing phase that led to this broken card. So back in the day, creatures were far less powerful. This was especially true of creatures that featured prominently in the Magic storylines. Then light dawned upon them and they realized, maybe our Spotlight characters should be playable or desirable. And since the early 2000s, legendary and story-relevant characters have been a little more pushed in power, so while I can't claim with certainty how much of an impact Oko's debut had on his power level, but they definitely want him to be a bit punchy, I think. In statements about the design of Oko, it's often cited that R&D originally had Oko care more about the exchange of permanents, but found that it wasn't fun. Looking at you, agent of treachery. Then, over the many stages of testing, they lost sight of the sheer power that came from invalidating key creatures and artifacts from your opponent. They didn't see how this could be used defensively, as it was essentially removal at no cost, as Oko increased his loyalty. Normally, removal on a Planeswalker is a downtick in loyalty, especially if it's replicating in an existing spell. Oko's +1 is, well, it's Beast Within. It's one of Green's best removal spells as it destroys that opponent's creature and replaces it with a textless 3/3 Beast token. Beast Within has also been noted as a color pie break for Green. Most other Green removal spells are fight effects, or require you to have a creature of your own. Beast Within doesn't have that. Now, while Oko was tearing up Standard, he was also legal in other formats of constructed Magic. This is an area I'm a little less familiar with, but essentially all the problems of Oko carried forward into everything else. Modern, Vintage, and even the newly formed Pioneer. For Pioneer, the meta was in total flux in the early days, so Oko wasn't perceived as a threat. Green Devotion, Copycat, Field of the Dead, and all the other decks of Standards past were what the meta started as. Quickly, the Devotion and Copycat decks were gutted, and that was when Oko started to inch his way back in. As things shaped up, the band seemed to be experimenting by stripping away the Oko enablers like Veil of Summer or Once Upon a Time. I believe this was a test to see if Oko was still broken without these key cards, and he was. Mid-December, Oko along with Nexus of Fate were banned due to Simic Food and Simic Nexus decks dwarfing all other decks in the Pioneer meta at this time in terms of win rates. Modern, meanwhile, had a similar bind. Oko lasted in that format until mid-January, and by then people were ready for him to be gone. It was at this point that the sheer degeneracy of Oko was becoming clear. Modern is a format with nearly all the best cards from over 15 years involved. The Modern format has had time to refine their strategies to be the most optimal it can. But when Oko came along, decks that didn't feature green or blue were suddenly splashing for green and blue just so they could run Oko. It was starting to get absurd at the lengths people were going to include this card in their decks, like Death Shadow or Jund. Weeks before he was banned was when we reached Apex Oko. It was when Mono Red Burn of all strategies was playing Oko. A deck based on killing people as quickly as possible was splashing for green and blue to play a card that did no damage to the face. The reason being that repeatable food tokens was excellent in the mirror match, as it allowed you to survive your opponent's burn, and your opponent was not likely to waste their own burn spells to destroy Oko. It was at this point that the ban hammer had come for Oko in Modern. He fared better in Legacy and Vintage and is currently not banned, though I don't really have much of an understanding on that format to comment there. So it would seem Oko was a serious case of a powerful card that slipped through the cracks. I'm willing to accept that, as from our perspective as players, the printed cards we receive are under the survivor bias. The survivor bias is the logical error we make by concentrating on the people or things that made it past some selection process and overlooking those that did not, typically due to a lack of visibility. The survivor bias has its claws dug into a lot of how we as humans do analysis. The problem is that we only hear about or observe the winners of a situation. We want to win or survive a similar situation, and so we want to know how the survivor did it. The problem is when we fixate on the winners, we don't really learn from the losers. A classic example of this is from World War II. During the air raids on Germany, the British wanted to add extra armor to the vulnerable parts of their bombers by analyzing where the most bullet holes were concentrated after a raid. The problem was they were only analyzing the planes that had not been shot down. The bullet holes that they were seeing were the ones the aircraft could take and still return to base. So instead, they armored the areas that had few or no bullet holes, like the engines and the cockpit, which were the places on the aircraft that could not take hits. So, let's put this concept into the context of Magic. As a community, we've been rightfully getting worked up over how many cards are being banned. Wild Reclamation, Teferi, Field of the Dead, and many others. We then look at the large length of time where bannings to Standard rarely took place. The conclusion you might likely come to is that R&D must not be doing their job. How can they be printing so many degenerate cards? Surely, R&D or the playtest team are either incompetent, or Hasbro is forcing them to print broken cards to sell packs. I've seen this line of thinking a lot recently. It's understandable, but I think it's not representing the full picture. As consumers, we don't know how many cards get caught in testing, nor do we know how much iteration a card goes through before being printed. We get a snapshot of the process in the M-Files articles and retrospective design articles. However, this doesn't show us complete information. And well, Magic is a massive game. Even Standard at any point in time can have card pools over 1,000 unique cards. That's a lot of game pieces to balance around. What I'm trying to express is that accidents happen. There's always room for error, and in the discourse, I don't believe that perspective is given much credit. However, we also need to consider the vast scope that is the player base and the playtesting team. The playtest team's manpower is puny compared to ours. So, we can crack a format much faster than they can, and we can find problems faster than they can.
Oh, come on! Oh.
Especially with the advent of Magic Arena and the speed at which information can travel enables the meta solving at incredible rates. Arena also has the unique environment where decks are relatively cheaper to make than in paper due to wildcards being equal in value. This allows casual players more accessibility to Tier 1 decks, and it creates a large player base to iterate on the format than in paper. So, this is all to say, I don't blame R&D for printing Oko the way he was. There were mistakes made, but a mistake does not mean incompetence. That said, let's observe the design philosophy in place when Oko was being created. The Fire Philosophy. Starting in Guild of Ravnica, but coming to its fullest in War of the Spark, Fire was an initiative to make Standard fun with varied decks that were fair and balanced in power, but had big, exciting effects. This is because back during the time of Battle for Zendikar, Standard was in a lower power mode to make larger cost spells more meaningful. The problem was that if a strong card was noticed, then the format would warp around that card. So they powered up Standard in general. If a strong card slipped through, then maybe its impact would be reduced. The added benefit was that with stronger cards meant non-standard players would pay attention to the new set and would buy packs. However, Oko and even Teferi Time Raveler proved that even under fire, unexpectedly strong cards will still warp the format around them. I'd argue that fire made Oko worse because of how powered up green had gotten from War of the Spark onward. Had Oko been printed in Battle for Zendikar when green was really weakened, he still would be busted, but I'm not sure he'd be as dominating in Standard. Now, I'm not here to say if fire is bad for MTG, but I can only hope that the designers can course correct before Standard gets to a place that it can't recover from. Certainly, there are other aspects of this era of fire, such as the companion mechanic, but that's a whole other discussion. 1 year later, Oko remains in the top echelon of Magic design mistakes. Never has a Magic card had such a game-altering impact. Hopefully, we never see a card of his caliber again. It seems that the designers are aware of Oko's problems, which is a good sign of things to come, but I do not envy the burden of the folks of R&D. Needing to balance between making cards people want and cards that are not too broken is a daunting task. Mark fought hard to make Eldraine a reality, and it would be a shame for it to all become overshadowed by Oko's sins. But, most of all, if I ever see another Elk again, it will be too soon.